Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Carleton's Varsity Racism, Equity, and Diversity Committee, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. My name is Jimi Aribido. I'm a fourth-year student here at Carleton. I play on the men's varsity soccer team, and I'm also a member of the Racism, Equity, and Diversity Subcommittee created by our varsity council. I'll be your host for tonight's discussion, and I hope that you're all as excited as I am because we have two incredible guest speakers waiting to speak with you tonight. And now, without further ado, allow me to introduce our guest for tonight. So first, he is a professional football player. He's currently a free agent in the CFL, a public speaker, a writer, a Carleton University alumni. Here's Nathaniel Behar.
How's it going, Jimmy? Thanks for having me.
Nate, thanks so much for joining us. How are you today?
Going great. I appreciate the time. This is exciting to get to chat with everybody and be a part of this awesome discussion. And I'm really excited that Carleton's bringing something like this to the forefront and allowing for this to exist. And it's exciting. I can't wait to dive into it. I know we got some questions and whatnot we're going to dive into. It's a great conversation. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to it.
Yeah, again, thanks for coming. We're looking forward to getting into that conversation with you. So I'll go ahead and introduce our second guest speaker of the night. She is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, focusing on critical studies of race and indigeneity. She's also the founder and director of the Indigeneity, Diaspora, Equity, and Anti-Racism in Sport Research Lab, or IDEAS Lab for short. Please welcome Dr. Janelle Joseph.
Hi, Jimmy. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Like Nate, I'm so excited to have this conversation and to have so many people in the audience, different stakeholders from Carleton and beyond. This is really a privilege to be here. Thanks.
Thank you again, Dr. John, for joining us tonight. And I'm so glad that the both of you are able to join us tonight. I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have. So without further ado, I'll jump right into it. No time to waste here. So Nate, I'll jump right to you, and I'll ask you to tell us a little bit about your experiences, as a Black athlete. What are some of the challenges that you face throughout your career that, your white teammates or non-Black teammates wouldn't have to experience?
Yeah, absolutely. The list is long, and it's complex for sure. I was born in London, Ontario, predominantly white city. My experiences were, I think I was actually kind of the first time I played with a teammate who was Black, and I don't think it was until I was like 14 or 15 years old to start, which is pretty crazy when you think about it, especially higher you get up into football and the more that percentage shifts in the exact opposite direction. And there's things that happen. I think being 9 years old was the first time, 9 or 10 years old was the first time I got called the N-word on the field and sort of accosted by teammates. And it's one thing, part of sports, as we all know, is the chirping and the yipping back and forth. And there's a whole other level to it when you take into account that players and people, they have this weapon against you, and they have this shared spear that they can thrust at you whenever you want. And, you learn that early is tough. I remember my dad had to have the conversation with me when I was young, where this lies and what this sort of looks like moving forward, and how you need to take some of the words from scripture and let no weapon formed against you prosper. You can't let those things sort of get to you. And then as you go and grow, it's just a different experience all the way through, from the conversations I heard about myself, and when you let yourself get stuck in the online chat forums, or I remember when I was the number one rated wide receiver coming out of university, and what was going on, where I was going to be recruited. There was chat forums about who was going where, and I remember all of them around me somehow circled around my ego and how I was a locker room problem and all these different things. Meanwhile, I'd been the captain of every single team I've ever played for. All my coaches had always leaned on me to be a leader. People who had never met me or didn't know anything about me was, oh well, God, he seems like he has a lot of ego on the field, and all these different things that you watch a Tom Brady do, and all of a sudden, what a leader! Wow, this guy is the fire inside of his body, and it's just those sort of things just continue to multiply to them. It just becomes noise to you. But you know, when you ask a question like that and you get a chance to reflect, it really is, you know, that over and over again. My being drafted to the CFL was the same conversation. It was between myself and a white receiver from Mac, or you know, not black receiver from McMaster University, who I tested better in every category, but everybody kept saying how this guy was humble and quiet and just went about his business, and I was whatever I was, which is just so funny to me. And you know, one of us is, you know, it's played out the way it's played out between the two of us, which is, it was never a competition between us. But it's just so funny how these things happen. These stations or stories start to build themselves up out of thin air, and it's an experience that I don't think, you know, people that are non-black can really, you know, get a can really understand or appreciate. But you know, conversations like this are important in getting there.
Yeah, well, thank you for that answer. And you sort of touched on it a little bit, but you know, for our audience, I'm wondering, you know, what are some of the ways that racism can be manifested, specifically in sport?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think there's so many, you know, there's so many, you know, small microaggressions and things of that nature that happen all the time. I know I'm probably the least qualified person of our two speakers here to speak on this. I know the doctor has published work in this exact area, and you know, I was reading a little bit about what she's spoken about with Naomi Osaka, and how prevalent that is, and how those things can just these tiny microaggressions that happen, and how the people want to shift the conversation and, you know, make everything about, or make it always about something other than just your talent. You know, Serena they always need to paint a picture about why she is so great, or, you know, something about her body that takes away from the fact that no, she's just worked harder than everyone who tries to play tennis. And that's the thing that's so frustrating in a sport. And you know, you do one thing and it's perceived one way. And I think, you know, I love the comparison between like a Tom Brady and a Cameron Newton in the NFL. They seem like very different people, but you watch them on the field and what they really do, they both come out and yell and scream it, and they yell at their teammates and they get after it. And you know, one of them is a locker room problem who doesn't know how to dress professionally and can't be a leader, and the other one is, oh, that's the heart of a champion. That's why he's the GOAT. He's the definition of a leader. And well, what am I missing? What am I missing here? That, you know, just because he doesn't dress like a JC Penney model does not mean that he's not all the exact same. Manifests in so many ways. It's just, you know, being present and being able to sort of stop when you hear something said, especially by the talking heads of the media or wherever it is, and ask yourself, like, wait, why did they say that? Like, if you can just add that second level of filtering when you hear these things from outside, and just say, wait, what does that mean? I've challenged even the people in my family to, what does that actually mean? Like, where is that coming from? And you start to unpack how deep this sort of stuff goes.
Yeah, then, you know, and I think we often forget, really, that at the end of the day, you know, we are just athletes, and you know, we really do just, you know, want to get on the field and show our talent and play, and that often, you know, gets lost in the conversation. And you know, I think this is a good time to bring in Dr. Joseph. And you know, my question for you is, I'm really wondering when and why you decided to start studying the intersection of race and sport.
I think anyone who goes into post-secondary education takes a moment to look within themselves and to their experiences, what they're interested in, and figure out what they want to study. When I was going into undergrad, I recognized that I had a passion for the sciences as well as the humanities, and I really couldn't decide between a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Science, and felt really fortunate that the discipline of kinesiology offered both of those perspectives on human movement and the body, and that was something that I was really passionate about. And so I continued with my studies in kinesiology, but upon reflecting on my undergraduate experience, I recognized that, you know, the kinds of things that I was really interested in from my own communities. You know, my father was an avid cricket player. My brother was a professional baseball player. And the idea that, you know, the stories of these Black men in particular were so absent from my kinesiology degree really piqued my interest and made me want to study more. You know, what are these intersections of race and gender, and how do they play out, and communicate those stories to my peers, my colleagues, because as Nate is saying, there's so much missing from the ways that we talk about sport, and the dominant narrative often is biased. And so I really wanted to open others' eyes into, what is really happening either behind the scenes within dominant sports or in alternative sports, and those sports that we don't hear a lot of. And so I chose to focus on Caribbean cricket and Brazilian capoeira and dance and Caribbean dance and many of the things that I was really interested in. When my brother was playing, he was in the minor leagues with the Florida Marlins, but before that, he was a varsity athlete at Brock University. And actually before that, he was an NCAA athlete at Campbell University in North Carolina. And through watching him and his journey through varsity sports and the opportunities that were afforded to him as a large and, dare I say, handsome Black man, and some of the limitations that were put on female athletes, on other smaller athletes, on athletes with disabilities, and the cross-cultural experience that he had playing with a lot of players from Venezuela and Dominican Republic, players who didn't speak English. Those kind of nuances were blowing my mind and nowhere to be seen in my kinesiology education. I didn't have any Black professors throughout my entire undergraduate experience. And not to say that Black professors are the only ones who can study this, but the interest for me was there. And so I recognized relatively early that I wanted to be that Black professor who was bringing these stories into the classroom.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that answer, and for I guess pursuing those dreams and continuing on with this research. So if you could give a quick sort of definition of what critical race theory is exactly, and where exactly does sport fit when we have these conversations on race and then critical race theory?
Yeah, absolutely. So critical race theory is this framework. It comes out of legal studies, specifically out of Harvard University, with Black professors who were studying the law and trying to conceptualize how can we explain this ongoing racism, right? This permanence of racism that we have within the Western culture. And because it is tied to colonial and capitalist systems, we see that racism kind of shifts, it changes form, but it is always present. And so they developed this theory that helps us to examine how does racism manifest in our many different cultures and spaces. And the reason for doing that is to try to make anti-racist change. So there are a few kind of key principles, and that the aim of transformation is definitely one of them. We can't accept the permanence of racism and the status quo. We need to push to make things different. And in order to do that, we have to recognize what Nate used the word microaggressions, what these maybe subtle slights, these jokes, these major macroaggressions, hiring practices, slurs. There's an entire system and network that is created to establish a hierarchy with whites on top and people of color on the bottom, and then stratifications within those different groups of people of color in different spaces. So critical race theory helps us to set a framework to ask questions in order to make that anti-racist transformational change. And one of the other key pillars is listening to the counter stories, we call it, the voices of the people who are marginalized, who have experiences that will say, actually, my community is not lazy. The reason we have been not in these positions of power is because we have been excluded. And when we take the opposite or that counter story, we really get a deeper appreciation for what's actually happening in the culture around race issues. And so we can't come from the outside, we have to go into the communities and ask the questions. And so that's what critical race theory does. And sport is essential within this story, within our Western culture. And I'll speak specifically about the North American or Turtle Island context. Sport is central. Whenever I go to any talks, especially this month over the last few weeks, even if it's not directly a talk about race in sport, race somehow comes up. Colin Kaepernick's name comes up. Tommy Smith and John Carlos comes up. These Exactly, the Black Power salute. These iconic people and images, Muhammad Ali, these names, particularly in the US context, but we have our Canadian heroes as well. These names keep coming up because sport has a central place in our dominant culture. And so we should expect that it has a dominant place in our conversations about race. And also, there are particular athletes who have used their fame, used the media attention to draw attention to anti-racism issues, and especially anti-racism as a human rights issues, right? Focusing on race, but recognizing that this is about class, this is about gender, this is about police brutality, this is about CEOs, who's in the C-suite of our major companies. All of these are interrelated race issues. And when athletes speak up about them because they have a platform, they become dominant cultural issues.
Well, thank you so much for that answer. And, to sort of shift the focus now a little bit to sport, you mentioned it earlier, and I remember talking with you last week, and you were mentioning sort of all the different sports that you've researched and you've worked with. Over the years in your research, do you find that the patterns or manifestations of racism are consistent across all the sports that you've covered, or are there certain sports that are more exposed to these patterns and manifestations of racism?
Mm-hmm. Well, drawing from that critical race framework, you'll know that I'll say that racism is pervasive. It appears in many different forms in many different sports, but it's not exactly the same. It is nuanced. We have some sports, particularly at the elite levels or the professional levels, where there is a predominance of Black bodies. And some people might think that, oh, that means that sport has progressed. That sport is post-racial. That sport is not racist. And I would say incorrect. There is racism there. Then we might look at the other extreme and we might say, swimming or gymnastics. And, if there's only one or two Black athletes in those sports, then, maybe they don't experience a lot of racism because they're the only one. And I would say incorrect. There's racism there too. So the idea that, we could distinctly imagine what racism looks like in those different spaces, it's going to be completely different. As I mentioned, on a baseball team where some people speak English and others speak only Spanish, there's going to be hierarchies, right? And so hierarchies around language, around other kinds of intersections of their identities. Racism manifests differently in different spaces, in different sports, even between the elite levels and recreational levels. A lot of my research has been in recreational sport and community sport organizations. And we see that even there, the difference between the power that is given to immigrants versus those who are Canadian born. There's a lot of different nuances to how racism manifests, but from my perspective, the fact that it is present in all of these spaces means that we have a lot of work to do across our education systems, across our sporting systems specifically, educating coaches, mentoring the next generation of coaches so that we can eradicate some of these hierarchies where coaches will make assumptions about certain players, and that can be the difference between them getting on a team or not, and that can change their life path.
And Dr. Joseph, it's almost as if you've read my notes here, because your answer really leads right into my next question for Nate here. And that is, you play a sport which is predominantly populated by Black athletes. But we see time again that ownership positions, refereeing positions, administrative positions are consistently filled by white males. What is the importance of having diversity across these positions, and not just looking to a league that's predominantly dominated by Black athletes and saying, okay, that's it, we've done the work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is the same issue in so many industries and places. And I'm now I'm not gonna say post-playing career, but my extended off season has allowed me the time to foray into the tech world as a founder of a tech startup here, and it's the exact same conversation. Without even flawed systems. Let me take a step back. Flawed systems and systems that are built poorly and built to amplify certain voices and not other ones. Even genuine or well-intentioned people within a flawed system will still lead to negative outputs or to flawed outputs. And I think that's something we see, in professional sports leagues across different sports across the world. Without having those people in place, then the messaging, the conversations, the things that happen around them are always going to be biased. It's like you can't tell the story of somebody that that's not yours, or you can't tell it as well as they can. And we see it a lot. Just hiring practices are one of the most, I'm not going to say difficult, maybe most complex things to really break, because people hire, and even when they're well intentioned, the first thing that every human does is they ask people around them, hey, who do you think could fill this role, and who do you think could fill this role? And with 65-year-old Caucasian males from the South in Dallas, Texas, who they know and who they're talking to is not often going to lead them to a super diverse candidate or a group of candidates. Mm-hmm. And we see it happen all the time. The problems that have happened. You have, without getting too into the hopefully forgotten politics of the last 4 years in the US, you have teams like the Houston Texans that are 85-90% Black men living in this country whose families for generations and generations have been oppressed and have dealt with racist policies, stopping for everything that has happened and pervades through the South. And now your owner, the person who has to sign the bottom of their check for every single one of their game checks, is giving money to somebody who says he wants to bring back profit first, who hates, who calls people who protest police brutality SOBs and all these different things. And this not having checks and balances in place where there are diverse thoughts, and these people at the top can't just say and do whatever they want without people that they respect in power, in seats of power, whether that's the head coach, a GM, vice president, whoever it would be, to say that no, you're going to lose your team. This is not how it's going to go. Without having people in those places, nothing changes. And it's the exact same in an NFL locker room, a CFL locker room, at Facebook, or at the Domino's Pizza down the road. If hiring practices aren't a priority, then it's never going to work. And on that, I mean, anybody in equity and diversity knows that the is in a room, no matter what kind of company you are, what kind of business you're in, the better your business or your company or anything is going to do, because diverse thought is the key to all of this, and it shows.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for that. And sort of talking about hiring practices, and I'll shift the conversation a little bit to barriers to access. And Dr. Joseph, I'll bring you in here to really explain, what do we mean when we talk about barriers to access, and specifically barriers to access for athletes of color, young Black and Indigenous athletes in sport.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we look at the broader culture, we know that there is a socioeconomic gap along racial lines. I should say stratification along racial lines. And so there's higher unemployment rates among racialized Canadians, particularly Black and Indigenous Canadians, or in Canada. And there are limitations that due to geography for many Indigenous communities. And so the barriers to participating in sport at every level, and whether that's as an athlete or a coach or an administrator, they are stratified also along class lines, along geographical lines, along gender lines. Our dominant system within university sports is a gendered system. And so, we are we are inherently excluding non-binary athletes. And then more generally within sports systems, we know that women and girls face more barriers than others. And so when you layer all of those barriers also on top of racial barriers, we recognize that people of color have more limited opportunities. It might be that the sport is really expensive to get into. There might be special tournament fees. Even if you are an elite athlete and you want to be welcomed onto that rep team, you might not be able to do it because you need someone to drive you far from your home. There are many different structural elements within sport that prevent people from joining. And then, as we're saying about the hierarchy around hiring into those professional positions. If you haven't been an athlete, the chances of you becoming a coach or becoming a sport administrator are also greatly reduced. And so those barriers to access, they compound around each other. Within critical race theory, we use this concept of intersectionality, and it's become a bit of a buzzword more recently, but I think we need to do a bit of work to really unpack the ways that the system is structured differentially impacts different people, right? All of us have many different identities, and those who are racialized as Black or Indigenous are also living with some of the other structural barriers within our culture that just prevent us from even sometimes getting in the door. There's the metaphor of that glass door where you can see inside and you can see what's happening, but you don't have a key. You're not sure how it opens. You're wondering, what are all those people doing? And the people on the outside are like, come in, just the doors, you're welcome. We welcome diversity here. And so that disjunct, really prevents what we might call true inclusion, and that diversity can't happen in the space if we don't even have access.
So, and on that note, because these aren't issues that have all of a sudden popped up in the past 5 years. These are systemic issues that we've been dealing with for centuries. What are some actionable steps, or rather, what do you think needs to change in order to lessen some of these barriers to access?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is naming them. And as I mentioned before, asking the people who are most affected is a good start, right? So let's name what the barriers are. If we look around and we see that there are no Black female coaches in our organization, then what can we do? We can look for those few experts and we can ask them, but we can't always put the burden on the racialized folks to do the work. So we can look at, what are successful organizations doing? How might they diversify? What are the hiring practices that we have in place? Are we just asking our friends, or do we have listservs that we access so that we can know who are the best Indigenous coaches in our country and make sure that we are giving them equal opportunity, not just because someone lives down the street from us or is a parent of our kids' team. Is that the way that we get connected with them? So we need to be really intentional about naming what are the gaps, where are people missing, what are our recruitment practices, and then really identifying how do we want this to change. And I know a lot of people are resistant to quotas or targets, and I think even before we go there to decide, what do we want this organization to look like in terms of really quantitative metrics? Can we just decide on some general principles? And I think most institutions generally agree with values of inclusion and generally agree with values of equity, but then we need to go that one step further and say, who is missing from this table? What perspectives are we missing? And the research shows that diverse organizations are more successful organizations. They are more profitable organizations. And if just those two factors can be motivators, profits and success, then probably most people can get on board, right? So at an institutional level, I think it's about examining your policies. When I do work with organizations, we often start there and think about, if there is, for example, a racist incident in your organization, what should people do? And if people are like, we're not sure, that's not a good place to start. It should be really clear, right? Because you've shown your constituents, your student athletes, your coaches, you've shown them that we recognize that racism happens here. So we're not going to pretend that it doesn't. And we want to support you. And so these are the supports that are in place. These are the mental health supports that are in place with culturally competent psychologists. These are the financial awards that are in place because we recognize that racialized student athletes have family obligations and might come from lower income communities. And so they will need additional support. And that's not because they're lazy or because they are less than, it is because of the structure of our culture. So, I could go on. There are so many different institutional ways. And then on an individual level, I think if we can educate ourselves, if we can learn to really appreciate, understand the experience of racialized athletes attending sessions like this and learning about learning about other communities, that is one way that we can help to shift our inherent bias. And all of us have these biases because we've been steeped in it through this Western culture. So at an institutional and an individual level, I think there's many changes that can be made.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I think it's important for us to note that, the start point, isn't really as far off as a lot of us imagine it to be. These are problems that on an individual level, both and on an institutional level, we can really start from anywhere. And we don't have to wait until structures are in place, or we really don't have to wait for anything. So thank you so much for that answer. I think it's really important for us to hold on to that. And Nate, I'll bring you in here because in recent years, and we've heard variations of the phrase "shut up and dribble," and that's been used to almost silence a lot of athletes when they come out and speak publicly about social and racial injustices. Why do you, as a professional athlete, see it important to come out and publicly speak about these social injustices and racial injustices that you see every day?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I need to put into perspective that a good percentage, probably closer to 50, that I'd like to, for the cathartic piece of that it feels to myself, the self-serving need to say something and get emotions out of my own body and out of my own head, is like, that's how I express myself. And I think that's how I get the mess of the world out of here, is writing often. But I think if you have a platform, and one of the things that this summer, is the summer of 2020, as it will go down in infamy, for various reasons. One of the things this summer made very clear to me was that for some reason people want to listen to people that are. I think that a lot of times they want to listen, to male athletes in sports that they find tolerable or mainstream for the wrong reasons. I think often is that they sometimes, I think they find me more palatable than somebody who's maybe spent a career in activism, who they think might rub somebody the wrong way or be too strong or and all these things on camera for CBC or CTV, whoever it may be. And so I tried to make my access to the platform at least be a bridge, or at least be a place to drop people who are much more qualified to talk about things than I am on their laps, and say, hey, look, if you like what I say, then why don't you go educate yourself with the people that I try to educate myself with. That's important, because my knowledge on race and society and everything is more anecdotal than anything. This is not my professional background, it's not my educational background. And as much as reading books can educate people and turn you into an expert on many things, there are so many people that are more well equipped, and it's interesting for this reason. It's like you want to speak out, and when like a LeBron James or a Colin Kaepernick or any of the many examples that Dr. Joseph alluded to earlier, when they speak, people listen, and there's value in that. And so these conversations need to be had. But I've always felt that my place and my role was never to be anything close to policy or anything like that. I'm more of a philosopher than I am a politician in every definition of the word. If I can spark a conversation to be had, or not have people bring me somewhere where a discussion is not going to be had, and people are going to be locked to their TV like the zombies we all are when we see what's happening on television, and they're going to at least have their brain go somewhere that it wouldn't otherwise, then it's positive. But no one should be asking me for what the next policies that Canada needs to bring in. They need to call in the professionals like Dr. Joseph. They need to call in people who have been fighting this fight longer and are just more well equipped. And my standing as a pro athlete in a mainstream sport does not make me better suited to handle these questions. I think it's an important distinction to have.
And on that note, and both you and Dr. Joseph have alluded to a lot of public figures that we've seen come out and speak. Do the Colin Kaepernicks and the WNBA athletes that risk their careers every day to come out and speak about these public injustices, do they give you a certain confidence to come out and speak yourself that maybe you wouldn't have if they hadn't have come out and spoken?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm probably outspoken to a fault. So it's a it's a great insult there. We talk. I think my mom and my brother made me way too confident in my own voice when I was way too young. During that early, but the women's WNBA are the quintessential example here. I had the pleasure of speaking with Angel McCautry a few weeks ago, who was at the spearheading the movement in Georgia as well to get out and vote. And those women are just like everything that humanity needs in every single way. Like one of the things I truly believe is that you're not doing anything that brave or that fantastic until you're risking something that you hold dear to yourself. And the amount of money that and Colin's a horrible example because he very literally risked his livelihood. But and certain people have made a career in other sports. If they lost all that, they know that they're going to be fine, which doesn't take away from that. But what these WNBA players do would be in a similar situation to if a CFL player or somebody in a sport that could lose their job and doesn't have the millions they're sitting on. What they've done, that's true bravery to me. Is they've put they know what vitriol comes at them on social media for anything. The comment sections of stuff like they know that the risk they took and then continue to take every day, and that's what makes them just far and away the beacon of light in all of this when we talk about athlete activism. But yeah, I mean, I think with it becoming, but with it becoming more and more popular, that I think there's just so many similar voices that have come up, and that's so important. And I think it does start. It starts with those names we all know, those household names, the Collins, the Muhammad, et cetera. And like I said, what the women of WNBA have done for the last few years now is just it's unbelievable.
Yeah, and I'll throw your name in there as well. And when I read some of the work that you published over the summer, it was inspiring for me. So thank you, for coming out and for speaking. And again, like you mentioned, allowing there to be a space where you may not necessarily know something, but you're redirecting people to resources where they can actually learn. So I do want to say thank you for that. And Dr. Joseph, I'll switch over to you now, because often, when we have these discussions on race, the term people of color, POC, is almost used as a blanket term to categorize all racialized people. I'm wondering, what are some of the dangers of categorizing racialized people in that way, using blanket terms, because we know that all racialized people, all people of color, do not share the same experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a danger, and it depends on the particular issue or particular community that we are talking about. So when people use that term, people of color, and they mean everyone non-white, they are erasing the histories of settler colonialism, the ongoing colonialism here in Canada that has limited drinking water for some people and not others. We need to be really careful, I think, in distinguishing these groups. And particularly, the term BIPOC has gained momentum in these past 12 to 18 months. And the emphasis, given that we are in the International Decade for African peoples or peoples of African descent, the attention to particularly anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, along with people of color, I think is important because the effects are different. If you look at our different systems, the push out, some use the term dropout, but the push out from elementary and high school for particularly Black and Indigenous communities, the differences in incarceration rates, the differences in employment rates, all of these things are not the same across all racialized groups. And I think one of the dangers when we use the term racialized or visible minority or people of color as a kind of blanket term, and we erase those differences, it allows some organizations to get away with some things. It allows them to say, look how diverse we are. And when they have not ever hired a Black professor, for example, or they have not ever engaged with Indigenous issues, because no one there was speaking up on behalf of the Indigenous people who were absent. So I do think there is a danger in the blanket term, but where that blanket term might be useful is when there is a distinction between the whites and the non-whites. So if that's where we're starting, if that's the issue that we're dealing with, then absolutely, let's talk about visible minorities. That's the language of the Canadian government. But parsing apart that that racialized group and really collecting detailed race-based data, again, listening to the stories of those who are marginalized will help us to get to what kind of change we need to make, right? We might have lots of diversity, but if it is exclusively Asian, for example, then we still have some work to do. And that's also not to say that those Asian people in that community might not also be experiencing some vitriol. You know, we've seen that extensively. The xenophobia related to COVID has been real and life-changing for some people. So I think we do need to be specific, particularly when it comes to sports. There is a general an overgeneralization that about Black physicality and Black assumptions of Black capabilities, which is damaging for Black people. On the other hand, there is an assumption of an innate inability, particularly around Asian and South Asian male athletes. And so those different stereotypes require different kinds of education, different kinds of inclusion tactics. And so we can't rest on our laurels. We need to be really vigilant, especially with those intersections within those communities of color.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thank you so much for that answer, Dr. Joseph. And before I move on to my final few questions here, I do just want to remind the audience that, you know, we will be having a short question period after our discussion here. So if you do have any questions for either of our guest speakers tonight, you can send them in the chat directly to me. And then, you know, at the end of this conversation, we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So Nate, I'll move on to you. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but, you know, this past summer, you came out and you published a very, you know, emotional and intimate essay, To Pimp a Movement. What really inspired you to write and share that essay, you know, at the time that you did?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this goes back to my last answer, and like the 49% probably split was, I very literally started that essay just like after, as we all remember, a very tough few weeks. You know, just everything that was going on, the online, you know, the stream of murder porn of Black bodies that just decided to jump out back again, just another hot summer, is just as it always does. And Twitter and Instagram just kept amplifying it, and then so people that usually amplify it were amplifying it, and I had, you know, non-Black people who were sending me the videos that like, oh my God, can you believe this? And it's like, I have literally no idea why you think that I would want you to send me this sort of stuff, but it all just built up. And I remember I was literally at the dog park with my dog, letting her run around, and I just pulled out my laptop and just started typing away. And I was listening to Kendrick, I think I was listening to All Right, and King Kunta. I was listening to the whole album, and it just started, and then it started to pull out. And I got lucky enough that, you know, the first kind of couple paragraphs I wrote had the, I guess the education system kind of works, because it had the meat and potatoes of the burger. It had an intro, a couple of lettuce and tomatoes, and a couple of pieces of meat. And I said, you know what, there's something here worth writing. And this, again, that cathartic release, it had been the first time I'd ever written anything long form. I've always written my poetry as my release, but that kind of feeling of building out something long form. And then I had the input of some incredible people, you know, Dr. Bedora Allegra at the University of Texas. She took a first pass at it and, you know, helped me sort of guide some of my thoughts, and her guiding them was just as much education as it was, you know, me cleaning up an essay. And that let me, you know, kind of unlock a couple aha moments of, you know what, I know that's true. And I hadn't shifted my brain to think about things that way. And I really just wondered if I could pretty it up enough, if I could border the line of what they call, I think, purple prose in the writing. You know, if I could border that line of being too pretty in how I write, but packing some real punch that I thought people would actually be able to digest and take the time to read. And I think it was able to strike a little bit of a chord, because I was able to dive into some challenging things. And, challenging people that are not Black to question the concept of whiteness is not exactly an easy conversation to broach with people. And I had people that that reached out to me that said they brought up that their whole family read it and they talked about it at dinner multiple times, things like that. And that stuff is that I never probably better than any touchdown on earth or any whatever else could happen was that feeling that people were listening and hearing and actually digesting the voice and the things that I've not been too afraid to say, but just never took the time to say, because it's just like, well, people aren't going to reconsider if they're white or not. That's just something that's in their head. Or people aren't going to reconsider whether they can understand the Black experience or not. That's just in their head. People aren't going to be able to shift their idea and change it that love is not enough and that you need to actually hate things around. Like you need to hate racist institutions, because these racist institutions are what have propelled them to on their pedestal with their privilege. And finding a way to say that, whether anyone's going to listen or not, or even read it, was just my cathartic release, and I'm happy I did, because it gave me a little bit of sanity, and then I think it maybe touched at least one person, which is all.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I would just like to read a quick excerpt from your essay actually, and it goes as follows. I quote: "If you are dissuaded by the uncomfortable truth that you'll find on your journey, then clear the area as we put on our hard hats with those who are brave enough and embolden the violent hum of the jackhammers to shake up this gory foundation." So, what advice do you have for people in the world of sport and, outside of sport who are looking to shake up that foundation?
I think that there needs to be a level of self-awareness with everybody involved, to be humble and selfless and just care. Not everything in Western society, there's so much Western society and in this capitalist structure that we have has just continued to amplify and to stack on top of itself all of the apparent benefits of individualism, oneself first, to be out there and go and grind for yourself and make your own money and do all and every little thing we hear about everything in our capitalist society talks about how you need to go and do it for yourself, how you need to go and do this. And we've moved so far away from what we are as people, which is members of communities, that the ability to just empathize with people around you is like, it's not gone, but it's so hard to tap into, or it's not the first thought to tap into. And if we were in 600 BC or whatever it was, and if there was a lion out there in our community that was threatening to hurt any single person, you would, well, maybe it'd be a little bit different, but you would hate the idea of the people in your community being injured. People used to, you need to just care about people, not because it helps you, but if everybody that you saw in a single day was happy and felt good and loved and had that glowing aura and energy of joy in them, your day would be better. That is just an unspoken fact. That is just without a doubt a fact. And there just needs to be that, just the sympathy and caring that, man, what the heck's the point? It's do you want to be king of the ashes? Because that's what the world is set up for now. Is if you burn everybody else down, you can be the king, but the king of the ashes is the king of nothing.
Thank you so much for that answer, Nate. And that's I think a message that a lot of us should really hold on to and take home. I know I definitely will. And Dr. Joseph, my sort of final question for you before we get into our guest questions here. What kind of effects, in your opinion, do you think an increase in inclusion and diversity, what kind of effects will that have on young Black and Indigenous athletes and other athletes of color growing up?
Thank you so much for the question. And I think it can change worlds, it can change lives. The idea that, people might not play with other Black players until they're teenagers, they might not have a Black coach until they are at the very elite levels, and actually maybe never. The fact that we could have inclusion, particularly in those positions of leadership and in those staffing positions, it can make a world of difference, because it can show a young Black or Indigenous athlete that there is a future for them. It can inspire them. It can make them feel connected and whole. So many of us are actually leaving parts of ourselves at home, You know, we're trying to speak with the most Canadian accent, and we are, you know, trying to, I've given up on it, but we're straightening our hair, or we are, you know, doing things that will make us more palatable to the masses so that we can feel inclusion. And if we just actually were allowed to be our whole selves, then we would probably play better. We would be excellent on the field, court, or rink, as well as in the classroom. We would be able to reach our full potential, and then that has spillover effects for our communities. More coaches and head coaches and general managers and sport administrators and athletic directors, they make a lot of money, and they also pour that money back into their families and their communities, right? So this is not just a singular issue. This is a community issue for racialized communities and our education communities and our sporting communities. I mean, if I can give a plug, this is why I'm involved in the Ontario University Athletics Anti-Racism Project. We want to look at racism in Ontario University athletics in order to discern, you know, who are the people who are participating, what are their demographics across the student athletes, the coaches, and the sport administrators, but also what are their experiences and what are their ideas, their recommendations for change. And it's through that kind of systematic research that, you know, we're starting in Ontario, and hopefully we can expand that across the nation. We can actually make systematic change and bring more Black and Indigenous athletes, coaches, and sport administrators into the system so that we can have that representation for those who are coming for the next generation. But I'll just emphasize it again that like diversity just makes sense. It makes it better for everyone. And it's not just for those Black and Indigenous youth or student athletes. We know that having Black leadership will have an effect on white athletes as well, and other white coaches and white communities. And so if we're trying to make an entire cultural shift, I think inclusion and representation at the top is one way to do it.
Thank you so much for that answer, Dr. Joseph. And you know, keeping our time in mind here, I do just want to get to a couple of our guest questions here. So the first one directed at Nate. What would you recommend to do or to say when a teammate wants to learn what more they can do about racism? And for these answers, I'll just ask, you know, again, for the sake of time, if we could just keep them short. Thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I think that you know, it's important to kindly thank, you know, when people want to learn, it's important to, you know, to support that and make sure that it's appreciated. There's a delicate line though, because it should never be, you know, it never needs to fall fully on the racialized to walk people to the fountain of knowledge and all that sort of stuff. And there's steps in the way. I think, you know, there's incredible resources out there now, especially everything that came up in the summer. And, you know, social media has its flaws, but it did do a pretty dang good job at aggregating resources and stuff. There's places to direct there. And then, you know, I think that, you know, finding a couple of writers that you resonate with and being able to speak to them is a great place. You know, you know, if you're the racialized one being asked, and you don't need to become the professor, but, you know, giving a couple of resource libraries is.
Thank you, Nate, for that answer.
We'll be able to use that and go somewhere.
Thank you, Nate, for that answer. And you know, jumping quickly here to questions for Dr. Joseph. As it pertains specifically to women of color, what considerations should we take into account, you know, versus and over and above men of color for hiring or for developing?
That's a great question. I think we want to look at the needs of your organization. So it's not going to be, there won't be a one size fits all or an across the board kind of response. You know, hiring women of color to coach men's teams, for example. We know I'm working with Hedia Karimian, who's the men's basketball coach at Laurentian. And so the dynamics between women in leadership positions over men is very important, and we don't have enough of that. The idea that women of color need mentorship, both along the racialized axis and the gender axis. So mentorship for taking on leadership positions, for how to be assertive and clear and communicate their message. You know, these are mentorship lessons that everyone can learn, but particularly for racialized women and people who are racialized and who are socialized as women, we are taught so many messages about being quiet, being small, about not taking up space. And so, you know, I think there's can be ways that when we read people's bodies, when we read what they say to us, we can put a lens or a filter to recognize where they're coming from and what potential they might have.
Thank you so much for that answer, Dr. Joseph. And I think for time's sake, we'll wrap it up here. That seems to be all the time that we have tonight. So I just do want to end by saying again a big thank you to both Dr. Joseph and Nate for joining us on the call tonight. Your answers, this discussion was one needed, and I know I'll be leaving with a lot of information and with a lot of takeaways. So thank you so much. I will ask if you could put your contact information, or where our guests can reach you if they do have any questions, or want to probe a little bit further. If you could just put your contact information into the chat, and just let people know where they can reach you, where they can find you. And yeah, with that, I'll end. Thank you so much to everyone who joined the call. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you at the next one.